Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Peter Smith. He is Emeritus Professor of Psychology at Goldsmiths College, University of London. His research interest is children's social development. He is a fellow of the British Psychological Society, the Association of Psychological Sciences, and the Academy of Social Sciences. So, Dr. Smith, thank you a lot for taking the time to be here with us today.
It's a pleasure. Hello.
Okay, great. So today we're gonna talk basically about bullying and also a little bit about the aspects of child development that are associated with bullying and also perhaps with play. So the first question I would like to ask you is, what is bullying for developmental psychologists, let's say, because it must have a proper definition, right?
Yes, the usually accepted definition is repeated aggression against a victim who cannot easily defend themselves.
Right.
So aggression would be a behavior that's intended to hurt someone. But that could just be a fight between equals. But if it's repeatedly done against someone who can't easily defend themselves, perhaps they're physically smaller or weaker, or they're outnumbered perhaps by a group of bullies, that's what we usually call bullying. There is some dispute about the definition, but that's generally quite widely accepted.
Yes, perhaps, I don't know, because nowadays we have much more awareness of this phenomenon. Sometimes people try to include in the definition other things like not only physical aggression or physical bullying, but also verbal and psychological violence, right?
Definitely, yes. There are various types of bullying, just as there are various types of aggression. And you can have physical bullying, which is the most stereotypical, I suppose, the image of the larger child beating up the smaller one. That's true, of course, that happens. But also we can have verbal bullying, nasty teasing and taunting, which actually is the most common. That's the most common kind of bullying. Social exclusion, systematically leaving someone out of your social groups, out of the peer groups. And more recently, of course, or this century, there's been cyberbullying on mobile phones and the internet. So a variety of ways that a person can be bullied.
Okay, and we're going to talk about specifically about cyberbullying toward the end of the interview, but I would like to ask you now, would you say, and perhaps this is a controversial question, but that bullying is somehow a normal part of children's development? I'm not saying that it is acceptable, but I'm asking you if it is normal for children to have that kind of behavior.
Well, that's an interesting question. To some extent, I'm going to say yes, but that doesn't mean we should expect most children to become bullies or victims. No, it's a minority of children who get involved. But there's always going to be a temptation, I think, if you're in a more powerful position to take advantage of someone else in a nasty way. And most people don't give in to that temptation, but some do for various reasons, which we can discuss. So we've got a significant minority of children, and also, of course, in adulthood too, you can get bullying, workplace bullying, and so on. All through life, really, there's going to be a significant minority of people who do get involved. So we shouldn't see it as something that's pathological in that sense. It's a normal temptation. Some people give way to it, but there are ways to try and reduce it and prevent it. And as you say, it's not really acceptable.
Yes, and that's interesting because there are some people nowadays that try to push for an approach to bullying that renders it psychopathological or pathological, that is, that tries to turn bullying into a sort of mental disease. But isn't it the case that bullies are usually not really socially inept, for example?
Yes, I think you're right. There is a sort of stereotype of bullies that they are socially inept, that they're clumsy, so forth. And that might be true for a small number, of course, because there's obviously a great variety of people, and children and people who get involved in bullying. But by and large, those who get involved in bullying can be quite socially intelligent. They can be quite socially skilled in the way they do the bullying. They probably choose the way that's effective in hurting the victim. They're going to choose the time and place where perhaps they've got their supporters with them, where they're not going to be detected by the teacher, say, if it's in school. So various aspects like this, we could say that bullies are quite, in some respects, quite clever, but they're probably lacking in empathy for the victim.
Okay. And isn't it also the case that many bullies are the ones that are popular in, for example, their schools, and many of the victims are the children or the adolescents that are a bit more socially isolated?
Well, you're talking about two things there, the characteristics of the children who get involved in bullying, and the characteristics of the victims, those who tend to get bullied. And they're separate areas to talk about. We should talk about them separately, really. But let's take the children who do the bullying first, because that's what we've been talking about. Yes, especially in secondary school, some bullies seem to be quite popular, or at least perceived as being popular. There's two aspects of popularity that psychologists have distinguished.
Right.
Actual liking, whether they're actually liked by most other children in the class or the peer group, and what's called perceived popularity, which is whether they're seen as being popular. And many bullying children seem to be perceived as being popular and not actually liked very much, because they're tough individuals, they're clearly hurting others. Many other children see them as being tough in that way, strong. That's partly perhaps why the bullies do it, but they're not necessarily liked, except perhaps by their own particular gang.
Right. So let me ask you now, is there any earliest age or earliest stage of children's development where bullies or perhaps children that have the tendency to turn into bullies start exhibiting bullying behavior?
Sure. Well, that's an interesting question too. We can see aggression in children from very early on. Really, as soon as they start crawling around and contacting others, they might be hitting another child, grabbing their toy, and so on. Normally, this at very young ages, like 1 and 2, we see this as a kind of exploratory aggression, not really intended to hurt the other. And normally, parents and caregivers are kind of educating very young children that this behavior is not nice. It's not nice to hit someone else. You should share toys and so on. And most children, of course, learn, what is acceptable and what isn't. But going through into 3, 4, 5, 6 years of age, some children may still be aggressive at times. That's a kind of temperamental characteristic. They also depend upon the family and so forth. Now, usually, at these sort of ages, 3, 4, 5, 6, the aggression is not particularly targeted against one particular victim. It's normally just these children are somewhat aggressive. They don't know how to control their aggressive impulses very much. So we wouldn't normally think of it as bullying. But round about 6, 7, 8, 9, this sort of middle childhood age range, for some children, it does seem to get targeted more at particular victims. They're learning that they can get away with this more with certain victims who are perhaps less able to cope, less able to be assertive and stand up for themselves, or perhaps not so liked in the peer group for various reasons. So then the potential bullying children, if you like, they're going to start targeting certain victims. So then we can definitely talk about bullying then. But certainly from around 7, 8, 9 years of age, we can see it happening.
And is there any established relationship between bullying and play, particularly in boys? Because as far as I know, around 2 or 3 years of age, boys usually start exhibiting rough-and-tumble play, right? So is there any connection there between that kind of play and bullying?
Well, not much. You're quite right. Young children are going to get involved in rough and tumble play, play fighting, play chasing, with themselves, sometimes with parents too. It can be quite an enjoyable activity. It's fun.
Right.
Children like that kind. It's a play. It's a play-that behaviour. They're laughing and smiling and so on. And you know, as a parent, I've enjoyed rough and tumble play with my sons. I've only had sons. So yeah, but there is a slight connection, because when you get into adolescence, 12, 13, 14, there's still play fighting going on, but sometimes the aggressive child, the potential bully, if you like, could take advantage of the play fight to actually hurt someone. Normally in rough and tumble play there's no hurt, or if there is, it's accidental, but it's not intended in any way, it's playful. But it can happen in adolescence that some children take advantage of that play convention, as it were, to actually hurt someone. They're on top of them in the play fight, and they actually twist their arm rather hard to show they're stronger, this sort of thing. So there can be a bit of that coming into it in sort of middle adolescence.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so
usual, but it can happen.
Mm-hmm. Right. So putting aside cyberbullying for the moment, what are the types of bullying that we have? And I'm also asking you this because isn't it the case that perhaps there are some sex differences in terms of the preferred types of bullying that girls and boys have?
Yes, there's age changes and there's sex or gender differences too, that's quite right. As we mentioned earlier, it starts off usually being physical with younger children, but also verbal, and verbal tends to become the most frequent kind of bullying as we get into, you know, middle childhood and early adolescence, but also what's called relationship kind of bullying, relational bullying, which is social exclusion and spreading nasty rumours. They're, if you like, more sophisticated kinds of bullying, and it's less easy for adults to detect them. It's easy to see when there's been physical bullying and someone's got a bruise or is hurt. You can hear verbal bullying, but social exclusion, spreading rumours behind someone's back, these are a bit more difficult to sort of pin down, as it were. So they tend to become more common with age, but also they're more common in girls than in boys. Girls tend to be less physical in their bullying, because physical strength is not so important for girls as it is for boys. On the other hand, reputation is very important for girls, and that's where relational bullying can really hurt someone if you're damaging their reputation.
Mm-hmm. And do children also resort to bullying to try to enforce or impose social norms on others? And I'm asking you this because I think, at least as far as I know, that there is a developmental stage where children really are a bit nasty when it comes to really wanting other children to follow certain social or moral norms that they identify.
Well, of course, the adult world and the school environment is going to be a big influence on what children think of as being socially acceptable and what these norms are, you know. So I wouldn't say it's sort of endogenous in children that they behave in this way so much. But we perhaps could talk now more about the victims, actually, which you mentioned earlier, that some children are more at risk of being victims, and certainly those who are different in some way from the norms in the peer group. They might be different in terms of race and ethnicity, they might be different in terms of faith, religion, they might be different in terms of having a disability, or having, in secondary school especially, having a different sexual orientation. All these kinds of things, unfortunately, can be risk factors for being victimized, because they might make the target more vulnerable to those children who seem to enjoy doing some bullying.
Mm-hmm. So you've already told us a bit about this, but what are some of the main differences between bullying as it manifests in infancy and in adolescence? Because I guess that perhaps in adolescence, adolescents take into account some aspects that are different than the ones they pay more attention to during infancy, like, for example, things to do with sexuality and other aspects like that.
Yes, well, certainly by adolescence, status in the peer group is pretty important. We know that that's a feature of adolescence. And that may accentuate difficulties for those who are seen as not having high status in the peer group, those who are different in some way. And you mentioned sex and sexual orientation there, for example. That seems to be a particular risk factor in adolescence.
So when adolescents deviate from the norm in terms of sexual orientation, they are more likely to be victims of bullying during adolescence.
Yes, that's very typically found, unfortunately. Having said that, there are steps, of course, that we can take to reduce that. It depends also on society norms. Society norms in these respects are changing, as we know, fairly rapidly. So we might, at some point, at least talk about what can be done to reduce these kinds of effects.
Yes, I'm going to ask you about that later, but let me just ask you now, are there any personality types or personality traits that really predispose children or adolescents to be either perpetrators of bullying or victims of it?
Yes, I think that's the case. For the perpetrators of bullying, they tend to be hot-tempered. They tend to take offense rather easily at actual or perceived slights against them. So they're kind of temperamentally rather likely to be aggressive and perhaps lacking what we call affective empathy, really feeling for the actual emotions of others. They may understand how others feel and they know how to hurt them, but they don't feel that sort of affective empathy for them when they actually see someone crying, perhaps. When we see someone crying, normally we feel concerned for them, but the child doing the bullying won't feel that concern. They might actually get satisfaction from demonstrating their power that they can make someone cry in that way. And some psychologists talk about moral disengagement. That here's an act which is hurtful, which is immoral, but they're disengaged from that by some means. They're perhaps thinking, well, he deserved it. He had offended me before, he deserves to be hurt. These sorts of mechanisms. So those sorts of things are quite likely in the children who are doing the bullying. Switching to the children who are going to be bullies, the victims, we've talked about some of the risk factors already, of course, in terms of being different from the norms of the particular peer group, but also someone who's not very assertive, who's perhaps physically weak, isn't able to cope very well with attacks on them. They will obviously be seen as easy targets by the children who enjoy doing the bullying.
And when it comes to contextual factors, like, for example, how the school is structured or how the social environment in that particular school operates, for example, what are some of the main factors that really favor the development of bullying in a particular school context?
Okay. By the way, I should have mentioned another risk factor for being a victim is not having friends who are going to be supportive for you.
Right.
If you've got friends to stand by you, that greatly reduces the risk of being victimized, for obvious reasons, really. And coming to the school system, many schools have peer support schemes, for example, which would be ways that a child who's worried about being victimized or actually being victimized, they can turn to the peer supporters for help. They can ask for someone to be with them at the lunchtime break. They can get advice from a peer supporter, these kinds of things. And more generally, a school that has a good school climate, that is concerned about bullying, that recognizes it can happen, but also has steps in place to deal with it, and there are a variety of steps that can be taken. These schools are likely to be less bullying going on, because as we discussed, the children who are tempted to bully, they're going to be looking at what the opportunities are, what the costs and benefits to them are of doing bullying. And there could be benefits for them in terms of social status, showing how tough they are, how strong they are. But if there's going to be a response from the peer group, a negative response from the peer group, who shouldn't be doing this, or from the school, clear sanctions from the school, then then the bullies are less likely to engage in their bullying behaviors.
And is it the case that perhaps schools that promote a more competitive environment, even in terms of perhaps grades and things like that, might also favor the development of bullying in their social context, or not?
So I don't think that's necessarily so. I think that's rather separate. The concern about good academic achievement is rather separate from what's concerned for rights and responsibilities and being respectful in the school environment. You can be respectful in the school environment and still work hard and perhaps feel some pressure to achieve.
Okay, so just before we get into cyberbullying, which is a very specific recent phenomena that we have, let me just ask you, can we consider there to be bullying or any sort of bullying manifestations also in adulthood? And if so, what kind of behaviors would that be?
Well, definitely. It's a lifespan phenomenon because going back to that definition of bullying we discussed at the beginning, repeated aggression against someone who cannot easily defend themselves, that of course could apply in lots of contexts and right through the lifespan. And indeed, there's a large field of research on workplace bullying. Workplace bullying tends to be a bit different, well, obviously a bit different from school bullying. School bullying is mostly within the peer group.
Right.
Children roughly the same age as you. Workplace bullying is very often more vertical rather than horizontal. It's from a management or superior in the workplace who's taking advantage of their position perhaps to impose impossible workloads on you or make your working life horrible in some way. So it's more commonly vertical rather than horizontal, if you like. There's also been work on bullying in prisons, bullying in old people's homes. If we consider the definition of bullying widely enough, then abuse in the family would be a kind of bullying too. If a parent is abusing a child, that could be seen as a kind of bullying. So, depending on how widely we take the definition, yes, of course, there's all sorts of bullying that could be occurring in different contexts and at different ages.
So at least certain aspects of domestic violence could be considered bullying, right?
Well, if one partner is definitely stronger, if you like, in a stronger position than the other, then yes.
Okay, so let's talk now about cyberbullying, because this is a very particular recent phenomenon and that only exists because we have access to certain types of technology. So first of all, what would you say are some of the main differences between regular school bullying and cyberbullying?
Okay, well, some of the characteristics of cyberbullying could make it potentially more harmful than traditional bullying. One is that it can happen any time, really. It's a 24/7 phenomenon. With school bullying, once you go home, you're away from it. At the weekends, you're away from it. In the school holidays, you're away from it. Cyberbullying, no. It could happen all the time, whether you're at school or not. It can happen in the night time. You know, unless you actually get rid of your mobile phone or don't use the internet, you're vulnerable to it 24/7. And of course, children, adolescents, it's such a major part of their life to be socially networked. You know, they don't want to get rid of their phone or leave the internet. Why should they? You know, for most people, it's an enormously positive and an important part of their life. So that's one thing. Another thing is, if you're being cyberbullied, the audience, the potential audience of what's happening, of your humiliation, if you like, is much broader. If you're being bullied at school, maybe half a dozen children see what's happening, or maybe your class, perhaps of 20 or 30 children know what's happening, but that's it. But if you're being humiliated online on some social networking site, hundreds, thousands of people might see that and see what's happening. So that audience is potentially much greater. Now, people have argued about the definition of bullying in relation to cyberbullying, because it's not so clear about repetition and this imbalance of power, either these two criteria we talked about. It's more complicated in cyberbullying. I think the definition can still be defended, but some people prefer to talk about cyber aggression rather than cyberbullying. We can talk more about that if you wish.
Yes, so if you could explain that difference then.
Okay, well, repetition is one of the criteria used in bullying. If I suppose I'm stronger than you and I beat you up in the playground once, that's nasty, but you probably wouldn't call it bullying. But if I'm going to do it, every week, every day I'm coming up and beating you up, definitely that's bullying, of course. Well, cyberbullying, I might post a nasty comment about you on Facebook, say, once.
Right.
Now, is that cyberbullying? The thing is, that comment, of course, can be seen and picked up by others, hundreds of others, who might like it, for example. Now, the argument is, I'm likely to know that that nasty comment I posted can be seen by many others, hundreds of others. Like let's say I've got hundreds of followers, many of them will like it, So I can reasonably expect that humiliation, that dislike will be repeated many times. So many people would say, yes, even though I've only done it once, we can call this cyberbullying. Now, the other thing is, am I stronger than you? Can you find, is it an unequal balance of power? Well, probably it is. Either you know who I am, who posted this nasty comment, and maybe I'm more popular than you and I've got more followers and so on, so there's an imbalance of power there. Or if you don't know who's done it, if you've got a nasty comment and you don't know who it's from, that in itself is a kind of imbalance of power because you can't really cope with that. You can't sort of fight back, if you like. You can't be assertive back to someone who you don't know who it is. So again, people have argued the imbalance of power criterion is, generally speaking, there in many cases, and we can talk about cyberbullying basically using a similar sort of definition. Not everyone agrees with that, but there's a dispute about that, but that's the argument.
Right. And I would imagine that particularly cyberbullying must be very difficult for children and adolescents because nowadays to be on social media, for example, is considered a normal part of being a social person or of socialization even, because if people avoid being on social media, they can even be at least partially socially excluded by others, right?
Yes, absolutely. It's a vital part of their lives. And we do have evidence that the effects of being cyberbullied are, if any, as severe as for traditional bullying, offline bullying, or perhaps more so. Having said that, if you're being cyberbullied, it may be easier to get the evidence. If you get screenshots, for example, if you keep the nasty text messages and so on, that's evidence for you to show to the school or your parents or even the police, because obviously sometimes we're talking about behaviour that's actually illegal.
And does cyberbullying show any kind of sex differences in terms of it affecting more boys or girls, or does it affect both equally?
Well, of course, it affects both, but it's interesting because generally, although for traditional bullying it's more often boys that get involved, for cyberbullying, many studies, not all studies, but many studies find girls being more involved in perpetrating the cyberbullying, especially on social networking sites. Because after all, girls are more involved than boys are in social networking sites. Where boys do get more involved in cyberbullying is on gaming situations. Boys are more interested in that, get online games. But for social networking sites, it tends to be more girls.
That's very interesting. So what would you say would be perhaps the best measures to take to try to fight cyberbullying?
Well, partly it's information. For young people, knowing how to protect themselves on the internet, how to use privacy settings safely, for example, on social networking sites, being careful what photos they send. Sexting obviously has been a big issue, which is related to cyberbullying, really.
Right.
Being careful what you share or don't share with friends. Being careful who you talk to, especially with people you don't know personally. education for parents too. Parents were typically an older generation, not so familiar always with these social networking sites and what's available on the internet. And for teachers, again. And keeping, if you are experiencing something nasty on the internet, keeping the evidence if you can, taking screenshots, keeping the text messages to show to someone, being aware of what your rights are, and seeking help if you really get into trouble. Seek help from someone you trust, peer supporter, teacher, parent, someone like that.
And looking at the historical trends in terms of the incidence of bullying in schools in particular, would you say that we can be optimistic about it? I mean, has bullying been in decline or not?
Well, interestingly, there is some evidence for rates of bullying going down, especially for traditional bullying. By traditional, of course, I mean the offline, the physical, verbal, and so on, the normal kinds of bullying that I would have been familiar with as a child myself before cyberbullying came into it this century. And for traditional bullying, not universally, but in many countries, there have been surveys, for example, the Health Behaviour in School-Aged Children surveys, HBSC, take place every 4 years in quite a large number of countries, and they tend to show a rather consistent fall in rates of being victimized. Not huge. We're talking about, say, falls from like 14%, 13%, 12%, 11%, 10%. You know, those sorts of order of magnitude. But it is getting better, probably because schools particularly have been much more active in, well, being aware of the nature of bullying and being aware of what they can do to try and prevent it, having good school policies, having peer support schemes, taking clear action when bullying takes place, things like this. Now, that's traditional bullying. Cyberbullying, more complex. That's the phenomenon of this century, really of the last 10 years, one might say, particularly, 10, 15 years. And it doesn't, as yet, doesn't seem to be going down in the way that traditional bullying is. Obviously, it increased in the first part of this century, because it wasn't really happening much at the turn of the century, and obviously it's become now not a majority kind of bullying, but a significant part of bullying is cyberbullying. So obviously it's risen, and it seems to have kind of leveled off, I would say, over the last few years. So let's hope, as we learn more about cyberbullying and ways of coping, particularly with cyberbullying, that might start to decrease too. But as yet, we don't have the evidence for that.
Okay, so there's reasons to be optimistic, right? Because at least a couple of decades ago or so, people didn't really care about what we now consider to be bullying, and things like, for example, boys fighting in the playground and things like that were considered just normal, correct?
Yes, of course, if it's boys just fighting in the playground, well, it's not particularly nice, but that's not necessarily bullying, as we discussed, unless, you know, it's systematic and against the weaker person. So let's just make that distinction clear, yeah.
Okay.
You're right, we're now much more aware of these things than we were a couple of decades ago.
Right. Okay, so Dr. Smith, let's end the interview here. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show. But just before we go, are there any good places on the internet if people want to get in touch with more of your work?
Oh, my work? Well, my website at Goldsmiths College, of course, will have some material. And more generally, in the UK at least, the Anti-Bullying Alliance website would be a good source. That's just antibullyingalliance.org.uk. So that's a good website too. And there are many websites available, of course, in different countries, and you can easily find them through a Google search.
Okay, so I will be leaving links to all of that and to your work in the description box of the video, Dr. Smith. And again, thank you a lot for taking the time. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show.
Oh, thank you very much.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would really like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Otherwise, if you don't like Patreon, you can also go to PayPal or Subscribestar. All of the links are in the description box of the video and also on my channel. And apart from that, you can also, of course, leave a like, share the interview, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons: Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larson, Ló Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condriano, and my first producer, Isar Webe. Thank you for all.